Look, I need you to understand something that most people aren't paying attention to. There's a weapon out there right now that could paralyze the most powerful military on Earth without firing a single shot. And no, I'm not talking about some sci-fi nonsense. I'm talking about 17 chemical elements that most of us have never even heard of. We call them rare earths. And right now, China controls the tap. And in April 2025, they decided to turn that tap not off completely, but just tight enough to make everyone sweat. Here's what happened. April 2nd, Trump announces his Liberation Day, new tariffs on Chinese imports, big headlines, everyone's talking about it. 2 days later, Beijing responds. No press conference, no dramatic statement, just a bureaucratic notice from the Ministry of Commerce. Notice number 18. Requires export licenses for 7 rare earth elements. Most people scrolled right past it. But for defense manufacturers in the West, this was the nightmare they'd been warning about for years. And here's the thing that makes it brilliant: it's not a ban. It's case-by-case licensing. Chinese companies have to get permission for every single shipment. Buyers have to provide detailed information about what they're going to do with these materials, who they are, where the final product is going. For civilian applications, approval usually comes within weeks. For defense applications, or anything with U.S. origins, the answer is usually silence, or an outright no. Now let me hit you with some numbers that should terrify you. A Pentagon analysis by a company called Govani found that 88% of critical mineral supply chains for U.S. defense are exposed to Chinese influence. 88%. That's more than 80,000 individual components across nearly 2,000 weapon systems. We're talking about everything from Tomahawk missiles to Predator drones. But it gets worse. 78% of all Department of Defense weapons could be affected. The Navy leads the pack with 91% of its systems containing at least one of these critical minerals. Let me make this concrete for you. An F-35 Lightning, that's America's most advanced stealth fighter, needs more than 400 kilograms of rare earths. One Arleigh Burke destroyer needs 2,360 kilograms. A Virginia-class submarine, 4,173 kilograms. Without elements like dysprosium, the magnets in jet engines can't maintain strength at high temperatures. Without terbium, radar systems lose resolution. Without neodymium, missile guidance systems lose precision. And here's where it gets really crazy. In 2022, the entire F-35 program got frozen when investigators discovered a Chinese-origin rare earth alloy magnet in the aircraft's engine. Delivery of these $80 million planes stopped dead until they could find a replacement. The Pentagon eventually had to grant a waiver, declaring that accepting Chinese components was necessary for national security. Read that line again. Chinese components necessary for U.S. national security. That's the reality we're living in. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so we just need to source these materials from somewhere else, right? Wrong. Because the problem isn't mining. The problem is refining. China controls more than 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. For heavy rare earths, the rarer, more critical elements, that number is 98 to 99%. And for high-performance magnets made from these elements, 90% of global production. This isn't about natural resources. The U.S. has rare earth mines. Australia has them. Canada has them. Greenland has massive deposits. But rare earths aren't rare because they're hard to find in the ground. They're rarer because separating them from rock economically without destroying the surrounding environment is incredibly difficult. China spent 3 decades building this infrastructure while the West looked away. They accepted environmental costs that Western companies couldn't or wouldn't bear. In Inner Mongolia, rare earth mining and processing operations have left barren wastelands, polluted river systems, and community health crises. But Beijing looked past quarterly earnings reports. They saw a future where whoever controls the raw materials of technology controls technology itself. Here's a guy named David Wright, CDO of a drone company called ePropelled. In June 2025, his company ordered magnets from a long-time Chinese supplier. The supplier demanded something they'd never asked for before: detailed product blueprints, a complete list of end buyers, and written assurance that the product wouldn't be used for military purposes. Wright said orders for civilian applications like agriculture or commercial use got approved relatively quickly, but anything defense-related, even publicly disclosed government contracts, got rejected or delayed indefinitely. That's modern export control art. You don't need to declare an embargo. You just create enough friction to make business unpredictable. The results came fast. According to Chinese customs data, rare earth magnet exports, especially those using controlled elements, dropped 74% in May 2025 compared to the same period the previous year. Not because China stopped manufacturing, not because demand decreased, but because the licensing system was doing its job, filtering out Western defense buyers while still maintaining civilian trade. Now let's talk about what this means for the weapons sitting in U.S. arsenals right now. A Government analysis revealed that only 19% of Defense Department weapons systems can access critical minerals without Chinese intermediaries at some stage in the supply chain. 19%. Let that sink in. That means 81% of America's arsenal, from Minuteman missiles to B-2 Spirit bombers, has at least one supply chain vulnerability where Beijing can exert influence. Take antimony as an example. It's a metal used in ammunition, fire-resistant materials, and batteries. The U.S. imports antimony from Australia, a trusted IUCS partner. But even antimony mined in Australia gets sent to China for refining before returning as a processed product, because China controls global antimony refining capacity. In August 2024, China added antimony to its export control list. Global prices surged 228% within 3 months. U.S. ammunition manufacturers started hoarding supplies in panic. By December 2024, Beijing expanded the list to include tungsten, gallium, germanium, and tellurium. Each of these elements is critical for different weapon systems. Tungsten for armor-piercing rounds, gallium for radar and military electronics chips, germanium for night vision and infrared sensors, tellurium for alloys and thermoelectric batteries. And here's the kicker. The prices of components containing gallium increased 6% in the 3 months after export controls. Antimony rose 4.5%. Meanwhile, all other defense components only increased an average of 1.4%. That's the cost of dependence, an invisible tax that Beijing can raise any time by turning the tap a little tighter. Now, the U.S. government knew this was coming. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act included a provision that seemed reasonable at the time. After January 1, 2027, the Defense Department cannot purchase, use, or deploy any weapon system containing rare earth metals or magnets sourced from China. The goal was clear. Remove China from the U.S. defense supply chain within 4 years. The problem. That goal was set by people who didn't understand the true scale of the challenge. To meet the 2027 deadline, the U.S. needs to build new mining capacity, develop refining and processing infrastructure, create domestic magnet production, establish a complete supply chain from mine to magnet, and do all of this at competitive costs, all in 4 years, while China spent 3 decades building their system. MP Materials, the Pentagon-backed company and the only rare earth miner in the U.S., is doing everything it can. They mine about 15% of global rare earth supply from Mountain Pass, California. But mining is just the first step. MP Materials sends its raw materials to China for processing. They've just started building processing capability in Texas, but that facility won't be fully operational until at least mid-2025. And even when fully operational, MP Materials will produce about 1,000 tons of neodymium, iron-boron magnets by the end of 2025. Sounds impressive. Compare that to this number. China produced 138,000 tons of N-Fe magnets in 2018. By 2024, that number increased to around 300,000 tons. 1,000 tons versus 300,000 tons. That's less than 1% of China's capacity. But the most serious problem? Heavy rare earths. Elements like dysprosium and terbium aren't found in significant quantities at Mountain Pass. They're primarily found in southern China and Myanmar. There is no heavy rare earth separation process operating in the United States, not one. And China dominates 98 to 99% of global heavy rare earth processing capacity. Research from Yale University and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory predicts that by early 2027, non-Chinese capacity for heavy rare earths will still fall short of demand. In other words, even in the best-case scenario, the 2027 deadline is impossible to meet. Policymakers are preparing to blur the deadline. The term they're using is phased approach, a polite way of saying we'll grant exemptions for almost everything. The Pentagon and its contractors face a stark choice. Strictly comply with the 2027 deadline and accept severe disruptions in weapons production, or grant broad exemptions and admit the deadline was symbolic. Most experts believe the second option is inevitable, but there was a moment in fall 2025 when it seemed like the U.S. had achieved a diplomatic breakthrough. November 15, 2025, in Seoul, South Korea, President Trump and President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the G20 summit. A few days later, China's Ministry of Commerce announced Beijing would pause implementation of some export control measures for 1 year as a confidence-building gesture. Trump immediately declared victory. In a tweet he wrote, "Great deal with China. They've removed restrictions. American national security strengthened. America first is working." A mainstream headlines followed. China concedes on rare earths after Trump-Xi meeting. But supply chain experts read China's statement with growing caution. And they realized this wasn't what it seemed. Let's break down what China actually paused. Notice 46 from October 2024. Some specific provisions related to gallium, germanium, and antimony were paused. But here's the key part. Article 1 of Notice 46 remained in full effect. Article 1 prohibits export of dual-use items to U.S. military end users or for military end-use applications. In other words, civilian exports can continue. Military exports remain blocked. Second, Notice 18 from April 2025, the rare earth licensing system, was completely unaffected by the pause. Case-by-case licensing requirements remained in force. What does this mean in practice? Chinese companies still need permission to export 7 critical rare earth elements, and Beijing still has the right to deny or delay those requests. One expert at Notre Dame called it, "Give me something to bring home, diplomacy." China gave Trump a headline without giving up actual control. Export data in the months following the pause showed a clear pattern. Gallium and germanium exports for civilian applications, especially commercial electronic chips, increased back near pre-control levels. But rare earth magnet exports and materials derived from the 7 controlled elements remained sharply down from pre-April levels. The licensing system was still doing its job, civilian trade flowing, defense procurement choked. And here's what really tells you everything you need to know. In July 2025, the Pentagon announced a groundbreaking deal with MP Materials, $400 million for preferred stock, purchasing their entire magnet output for 10 years, committed floor prices. This is the clearest state intervention in critical minerals. But time is the deciding challenge. The Round Top project in Texas aims to meet 20% of U.S. demand by 2027. The Relevant project targets recovering 90% of rare earths from EV batteries by 2025. The 2025 Defense Authorization Act includes $1.2 billion for stockpiling and $350 million for domestic production. Sounds good, right? But a Rand Corporation analysis from 2020 forewarned that a supply chain disruption lasting just 90 days could force 78% of U.S. defense contractors to shut down production lines. Meanwhile, China is expanding ammunition production and acquiring advanced weapon systems at 5 to 6 times the rate of the United States. So here's where we are. This isn't a race with a fair starting line. One side has been running for 30 years and controls 90% of the track. The other side just started building running shoes. The question isn't whether America can catch up. The question is whether America has enough time to learn how to run before the race is over. And that brings me to what really keeps me up at night. This isn't about economics anymore. This is about power. About how one nation quietly built a monopoly in an industry that other great powers ignored, because it was too dirty, too expensive, and seemingly not attractive enough. While Western CEOs looked at quarterly balance sheets, Beijing looked at geopolitical maps 3 decades into the future. And now, when the world wakes up, they discover they're too late. In a potential conflict with China, America's ability to sustain weapons production depends on China continuing to supply raw materials. Let that paradox sink in. The adversary controls the supply chain of your weapons. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union never controlled America's weapons supply chains. In World War II, Japan never had veto power over U.S. steel production. But today, China can't stop America from building a new F-35. But they can make it so slow, expensive, and difficult that it becomes impractical. And that's a different kind of power. Not about winning a war, but about making your opponent unable to fight in the first place. Admiral Samuel Paparo, INDOPCOM commander, described China's export control system as a strangler strategy, not killing the victim immediately, but tightening gradually until they can't breathe. This is 21st century economic warfare, not about flashy sanctions or loud embargoes. It's about controlling flow, creating uncertainty, making your opponent play by your rules with no other choice. And the worst part, there's no quick exit. Because the problem isn't just buying rare earths, it's knowing how to process them. You can't download a software patch to fix this vulnerability. You need to build an entire new industrial infrastructure. And that takes years, if not decades. China spent 3 decades creating this system. How can we replicate that in 3 years? The short answer, we can't. So what's the lesson here? This is a strategic disaster that was predicted long ago. For 15 years, analysts warned about rare earth dependence. For 15 years, policymakers nodded and did nothing meaningful. Because building processing facilities isn't sexy. It doesn't win elections. It doesn't generate exciting press releases. But now the bill has come due, and it's being paid in strategic vulnerability, in increased weapons costs, in delayed production timelines, and in the quiet knowledge that in a real crisis, America's most advanced weapons might not have the materials they need to function. This isn't a story with heroes or clear villains. Just economic decisions that seemed rational in one era leading to strategic catastrophe in another. Just a superpower discovering that the fighter jets, submarines, and missiles they're so proud of could be shut down by an administrative decision in Beijing. And here's what really bothers me. We're still not treating this with the urgency it deserves. We're still talking about market solutions and private investment and gradual supply chain diversification. While China has already won the race and is now deciding how generous they want to be with the terms of our dependence. The invisible bullet is already in flight. It's been traveling for 30 years. And it's aimed right at the heart of American military power. The question now isn't whether it hits. The question is what we do when it does.